Thank you, Ethan, for that nice introduction. And thanks to Magers and Quinn for hosting this event. I had suggested this to Ethan back in the winter, and they were never anything less than enthusiastic about having me. So this was always my destination when I came to a Minneapolis bookstore, and I'm very glad I landed here. I want to tell you a little bit about the book. I'm going to read a little bit about the book. It's nice to be here and see so many old familiar faces. You know, whenever I come back to Minneapolis, I have this feeling of what a special place Marshall U was, and I think there's probably a few people here who will at least remember the place, if not agree with me. So it's always nice to be back with old friends. I'll really date myself here. I even attended an advanced placement class at the old West High School, which was right down here on Hennepin, and you have to be really old to remember when West High School was there. So,
I beg your pardon.
You know, people have asked me a lot. They said, "Well, you know, why did you write this book? It's so long ago and so obscure." And I usually say because it's just a great story. It's just a story of what happened. The events themselves are so amazing, and you, as a writer. As a fiction writer, I would never dare to make them up, the kind of plot twists that this book has. And when I realized that they had all happened, I thought that was really terrific. And so for a long time when people said, "Why did you write this book?" I said, because it was such a great story. But as I got into the book, I realized there was actually more to it than that. And the book actually had an even more profound message. And that was that this book takes place between the Revolutionary War period, the founding of the country in the late 18th century, and the Civil War, which are the two great periods in American history that get written a lot about historians, the American Revolution and the Civil War. Period in between, kind of ignored. And what I realized as I was writing this book is pretty much everything you know about that period and everything that you've been taught about that period is flat wrong, is completely wrong. And so I realized that part of this book is to tell people that everything you thought you understood about this time is completely wrong. So if you think of Washington in 1835, 25 years before the Civil War, what would you think? You would think, well, slavery was well entrenched. The black people were miserable. The whites were kind of cruel and indifferent. And that's actually not true at all. In Washington had about 30,000 people then as a city. 12,000 of them were black. The majority of the black people in Washington actually in 1830 were free, were not slaves. Out of the 12,000 black people, slightly more than half were free. Some were prosperous and others were getting there fast. There was a man named Lynch Wormley who owned a big livery stable about 2 blocks from the White House. And he served horses to the city's taxi trade. He was a free black man from Madagascar. There were 2 brothers, Thomas and Isaac Carey. They owned a couple of barber shops on Pennsylvania Avenue. They came from a free black family in Virginia that had been free for generations. In fact, one of those black families that owned slaves themselves. The Carey brothers also, while they were cutting hair, would also sell anti-slavery publications on the side. And the hero of the book, Beverly Snow, ran the city's finest restaurant called the Epicurean Eating House. He's really the hero of the book. I kind of think of him as a Barack Obama, slightly ahead of his time, a very clever, intelligent, mixed-race man who kind of comes out of nowhere to conquer and charm Washington, serve the Washington elite what they want, only to face a tremendous backlash. And I think if you read the book, you'll see some parallels to our own time there. But anyway, the point is that in this book, far from slavery being dominant in Washington, D.C. and all oppressive force, slavery is actually receding, and the forces of liberty are growing. And that's really part of what this book is about. A second thing you probably think the Civil War began in, April 1861 with the gunfire at Fort Sumter. That's when the shooting of the Civil War began. But part of the argument of this book is that the Civil War actually began 30 years before that. It is in this period, in the early 1800s, that the anti-slavery movement first comes to Washington, and the direct ideological conflict that leads to the Civil War, the conflict between the people who are for slavery and the people who are against it, it actually starts in this time in Washington. That's not something that you get taught in the history books, but you'll see from this story that that is actually the case, and that's what happened. So it's this band of people, the Carey brothers, Lynch Wormley, Beverly Snow, who actually are the ones who really start the fight against slavery that leads to the Civil War and the great expansion of American freedom that brought. They had this little group of black entrepreneurs had a white friend, a man named Ben Lundy. He was an itinerant editor, traveled around the country, kind of like a familiar fate for me. And he had an anti-slavery newspaper called The Genius of Universal Emancipation, and he would travel around, and most of the newspapers of the day, the MSM of the day, really avoided the slavery issue and didn't really, I mean, they'd report on the politics of it, but they didn't really want to get into it. Ben Lundy went around the country and he reported, there was a killing, this man was beat, here's how these slaves escaped, here's how the churches have caved in. I mean, he really did real investigative reporting about slavery. It's quite unprecedented at the time. And as anti-slavery sentiment as this movement starts to grow in Washington, he has enough money to hire a new assistant, and he hires a promising young man from Boston named William Lloyd Garrison. And he teaches William Lloyd Garrison how to be a journalist and how to report about slavery. And in a great irony, Benjamin Lundy would go on to die in obscurity, and William Lloyd Garrison would go on to become the most famous abolitionist editor and one of the most influential American journalists of the 19th century. He's a character in this book, too. Another thing you probably think, well, the only important thing that Francis Scott Key did in his life was write the lyrics to the Star Spangled Banner. Wrong again. After Francis Scott Key wrote the lyrics to the Star Spangled Banner in 1814, he went on to a long and very interesting career in politics, which is completely unknown to most people. Francis Scott Key really was kind of a modern Washington character. After he became famous in 1814 for writing the Star Spangled Banner, he did what people in Washington usually do. He parlayed his fame into a lucrative law practice. And then he parlayed his lucrative law practice into political connections. And then he parlayed his political connections into a job. And that was the culmination of Francis Scott Key's political career in 1833 when he was appointed to be the district attorney for the city of Washington. And what he did in that time was I wouldn't say it was as significant as writing the Star Spangled Banner, which was obviously an enduring feat, but it was very important. An unknown fact about Francis Scott Key is that his best friend and brother-in-law was a man named Roger Taney. And Roger Taney was, like Key, very politically ambitious, and with Key's help, ascended 2 jobs in the administration of Andrew Jackson. First, Key helped Taney become the U.S. Attorney General, then the Secretary of the Treasury, and then in 1836, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Roger Taney went on to write the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which effectively legalized slavery and hastened the coming of the Civil War. So Key and Taney were inseparable political figures in this period, and influential and important, and in a way that has been totally forgotten. In Washington, there's a Key Bridge which crosses the Potomac River, and right by where it is a park where Key used to live, his house. And in the park, there's lots of exhibits that are devoted to him. And there's one that says Key was active in anti-slavery causes. And this is flat wrong. It's completely wrong. It would be much more accurate to say that Key was active in suppressing anti-slavery causes. Part of the point of this book is that to remind people of all the things that we really don't want to remember about our own history. So this is also a book about the real Francis Scott Key. But I don't want to give the wrong impression. This book is not a polemical book. It's not out to score